Tonight we actually have a fantastic group of very experienced physicians and nurses. The point of the evening tonight is to try and talk about hospital-based glucose control, particularly in the critical care setting. With us tonight we actually have right here next to me is Dr. Jeffrey Joseph. Dr. Joseph is an anesthesiologist at Jefferson Hospital. He's the head of the Artificial Pancreas Project at Jefferson Hospital. And Dr. Joseph also has a unique background in the medical device business. He was a founder of Animas, an insulin pump company and glucose monitoring company that was acquired by Johnson & Johnson. So Dr. Joseph gets both the clinical trial and the product development, but also what it's like to run a business and be tortured by investors as a small company. We were just talking about that, actually. Next to Dr. Joseph, we have Dr. Furnari. Also, there's a Jefferson connection there. Dr. Furnari trained in surgery and did his cardiac fellowship at Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia. Dr. Furnari is the head of the Starward Cardiac Group in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon. Dr. Furnari is also the author and the founder of the Portland Protocol, which is widely used in tight glycemic control settings in the critical care setting in the hospital. So a major heavyweight, if you Google Dr. Furnari's name, you would see that he's also known as the father of tight glycemic control. Next to Dr. Furnari, we have Eileen Donnelly. I'm actually a former surgical resident at Jefferson. Eileen was a nurse, still is a nurse at Jefferson. She used to pistol whip me all the time when I was a medical student, and an intern and a resident. I'm surprised I actually invited here tonight. She made my life so difficult, but thank you for coming, Eileen. Eileen has a lot of experience in the critical care setting as well. We wanted to provide a nurse's perspective for use of a CGM device in the hospital, and we think Eileen will do that for us. And last but not least, we have Dr. Stan Nazarway. Dr. Nazarway is the head of the surgical intensive care units up at the Tufts Medical Center in Boston. He's the author of over 100 articles on critical care subjects from sepsis to glucose control. Dr. Nazarway has also had the, I guess you would say the privilege, some maybe say the displeasure of being involved in 3 of our clinical trials now. We actually just preliminarily reported data from a study at Tufts in cardiac surgery patients where Dr. Nazarway was the primary investigator. Hopefully we'll be announcing that data or presenting that data at a critical care meeting sometime later this year. And last but not least, to round it out, we wanted an ECHO representative up on the panel tonight. We have Samir Farrar, who just hoovered down some beef tenderloin. Samir is going to provide ECHO perspective if anybody has any questions about the technology. Samir is our VP of product development. Samir came to us by way of by way of Philips, and prior to that, Abbott. He successfully developed several diabetes devices. So that's our panels tonight. Thank you for coming again. Let me just give you a little bit of background on Echo Therapeutics. We are a public company. We trade on the NASDAQ. What we're really focused on is glucose monitoring initially in the critical care setting. You'll see a demonstration, a video tonight of our device. Our device is initially being developed for use in the hospital environment. We're initially targeting critical care. We ultimately anticipate that moving out onto the floors where it will be used more broadly. And then finally, this device is very easy to use as well. We anticipate this will also be a widely adopted down the road device in the diabetes space, in the consumer space as well. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this system tonight and ask these questions. This is also something that we can adapt over time to be used in the broader diabetes market, which, as everybody knows, is very large and growing rapidly. The system that we're going to talk about tonight is our glucose monitoring system. It's called the Symphony TCGM system. That's transdermal continuous glucose monitoring. It is a non-invasive wireless glucose monitoring system. And that system incorporates a technology up there called the Prelude Skin Prep system. What we're doing that's different than the other CGM companies is we're doing glucose monitoring, continuous glucose monitoring without a needle.
In terms of what would influence us at Tufts Medical Center, it would have to be a combination of low hassle. I think Eileen will speak to this. Nurses are strong influences. We may have all kind of whiz-bang technology that we favor, but if it's constantly alarming and being fussy, nurses will pitch it out the window or pitch it at the physicians who chose it. And either way, it's a losing strategy. So if it's fussy, we'll just ditch it and we won't use it. We've done that. We've purchased expensive equipment, turned out to be more fussy than we ever imagined, and not as accurate as we thought, and we don't even use it, just sits somewhere in some corner. So I think the fussiness factor is important, and I think some sort of reasonable acquisition cost and maintenance is going to be very key too. You may have noticed I'm in Massachusetts, and healthcare is right up top with all of the major issues in politics statewide and nationwide. And just today, the legislature in Massachusetts passed legislation in which they're going to begin to reduce what they pay to providers and assess a 20% luxury tax for people who overcharge. So now that we have universal health care in Massachusetts, they've figured out, oops, we can't afford this actually after all. So now they're going to start reducing paybacks to the providers. That means the cost of purchasing equipment and other sorts of costs is going to be even more preeminent than it already has been. So I think a combination of fussiness and cost acquisition with the notion that it's reasonably accurate is what we're going to look for.
I think that the most non-invasive, the most non-cumbersome monitoring device would be key. The patients are already inundated with central lines. Often they're intubated, chest tubes, whatever. I mean, I think that from my perspective anyway, you don't want something that's going to add another element of, it just gets cumbersome. And you do want accuracy.
What do you see the shootout looking like? To me, that's the all-encompassing question. And I think it involves 4 factors. It involves invasiveness, accuracy, cost, and the cumbersomeness, or the amount of interactivity, ease of interactivity. So those are the 4 pieces. And right now, cost and interactivity are kind of taking a back seat. So all the companies are heading down one of 2 pathways. There are companies that are heading down accuracy and not worrying about invasiveness. There are companies like Echo that are heading down the non-invasive pathway first. And it's not that they're not worrying about accuracy, but they're saying, okay, the standard right now is what we're going to shoot for. And I've said this before, what's going to happen is as these companies become approved, once the accuracy companies are heading down that side of the pathway, once they get accuracy, they're going to try to turn back towards non-invasiveness. Once the non-invasive companies become approved, they're going to start turning more towards accuracy. And the winner is going to be the one to get to the least invasive, most accurate, the top of the pinnacle first. Now, as I look at all the companies out there, there's only one company that's going to win non-invasively, and that's Echo. And with continuing modifications of the algorithm, with continuing modifications of what we find in clinical trials, it's going to become more and more accurate. So if you have and honestly don't know your background or who you are or anything like that, I apologize for that, but if you have a long-term view of this, and you have a view that says who's going to get to that pinnacle first, I think Echo is the most well-positioned to be at the pinnacle. And the other components of that, what's that shootout going to look like, really then comes down to cost, effectiveness for the administrators. That's how they're going to choose. And for the nurses, it's going to be ease of interactivity, because these nurses, you know, it takes, in a really good center, to do each glucose measurement today takes 5 minutes. And so that's 1/12 of an hour, every hour. And that's a lot of time. When you add it all up, I can tell you the financial analyses are true and they're real, because when you put that all together, we're spending somewhere between $170 and $250 a day on doing tight glycemic control measurements and keeping patients in a safe range.
And actually, as an adjunct to that, it's not the $100 or $200 a day in strips and nursing time, because the nurse is going to be there no matter what. It's just how do you utilize him or her. I think the greater gain is if they're not dinging around, wasting their time using this 1980 technology to measure intermittent or episodic strips, they actually can use their time to be a real nurse at the bedside and do something that's really important as it relates to patient care or comfort. So there's an added unmeasured benefit if we can free them up.
Our hospital does 32,000 point-of-care measurements per month. And in the entire hospital, not just the ICUs, 4% are below 70, 21% are above 200. So there's already a lot of time, effort, resources going into glucose monitoring, and it's not being done well. Now that we have CGM and the trend data, it's like before pulse oximeters or before continuous monitoring in the ICU, once you have the trend data, it can see that it's trending downwards at a fast rate of change. You're never going to want to go back to the episodic measurements because you're flying blindly.
You know, I think that what will happen, based on hard-gained experience, is that once devices have been FDA approved and are available, trend-setting hospitals or desperate hospitals will invest. And they'll start off with not buying, you know, something for every single bed. They'll say, let's do a pilot. You know, we'll buy 2 or 3 devices for 10 beds, and we'll move the devices around and see how we like it. The same thing happened with pulse oximetry. Pulse oximetry that gives you a continuous readout of arterial oxygen saturation was a device that was mounted on an IV pole, and you rolled it from bed to bed wherever you needed it. You had 1, maybe you had 2. Well, after a period of time, when it became so obvious, independent of any evidence to prove that it changed outcome, when it became so obvious, it was just so important, and we were so dependent on it, and it made life so much easier, centralized monitoring companies began to integrate it into their central column. And then they made it available. And over time, 15 years maybe, hospitals eventually wanted them on every bed in the ICU and in every OR. And oh, wait a minute, we also want them in special procedures where patients are known to aspirate and die from a lack of oxygen. And oh wait, we need it down in the emergency department too. And actually we have some really sick patients in clinic. We could use one there. So yes, I think the adoption will be widespread for 2 reasons. One, I think it'll become evident that this is a problem, hyperglycemia and outcome, not just in the intensive care unit, but for the entire continuum of illness that a patient is hospitalized, and that they will need better monitoring and better glucose control, not just in the intensive care units, but as they get a little bit better but are still hospitalized and out on the surgical and medical floors. We're going to need technology that are going to help fewer nurses with more patients to care for out on the floors, not just in the ICU. That's where I think the adoption will take place, not even just in the ICU. And so today, we have pulse oximetry scattered throughout the floors, not just in the ICUs.
So Stan and I often look at things a little bit differently, but I totally agree with the last piece of your comment, and we've already proven that it improves outcomes if you use it on the floor. And one of the areas we disagree with, I don't think this is an intensivist only sport. I think this is really, it's about the hospital stay. It's not about where you live in the hospital. It's about controlling glucose. And I've said before, this is not a therapy of location, it's a therapy of duration. And it would be like saying, you know, we only give antibiotics when people are in the ICU. That makes no sense. Makes no sense whatsoever. So for this to be confined to the ICU is absolutely stupid. Now I'm talking like a cardiac surgeon, right? So,
the one I remember anyway.
The one you remember, right? But I look at the adoption probably a little differently than Stan. And I look at it because if we look at the data, and every company and every VC that's come to me and asked this question, I've answered the same way. From the business standpoint, if one creates their business plan around the proven populations right now are diabetes, heart surgery, and ICU patients on TPN, and that's it. Everything else is an extrapolation of those data. Those data have never been disproven. Everything else is extrapolation. Now, do I think it should be applied to everybody? I probably do, because number one, you don't know who's going to be in the ICU for a long time. You don't know which heart surgery patients have diabetes, so it's probably the whole heart surgery population. So I think it's going to roll out in a piecemeal fashion, but I think hospitals are going to want it, hospitals that are doing tight glycemic control now are going to want to roll it out in those critical populations first. As it works, it will expand, like Stan said. So I look at it slightly differently, but I think it's going to achieve ubiquitous use.
Actually, we're in total agreement. He just, as a cardiac surgeon, doesn't understand that. I think that and I actually used the same analogy at Grand Rounds today where I gave this talk. why would you give beta blockers for someone having a heart attack while they're in the ICU, but not for the continuum of illness out on the floor as they continue to recover from their heart attack? No, you'd give it for the entire duration. And the same should be true for glycemic control. The reason I think the ICU is a focus is not because I'm an intensivist and therefore we should all be intensivist driven. It's because the preponderance of evidence that suggests you may improve outcome in patients happens to be in the ICU. There's only one prospective randomized control trial that's been done on floor patients, and it did show that it made a difference, but it's just one study of just 211 patients. So we need more floor evidence in a randomized controlled fashion. So that's one reason everyone's focused on the ICU. And then the other thing is, you know, if you're a hospital and you're going to spend money, you're going to spend it on your sickest, most cost-intensive, resource-consuming patient group anyway, and frankly, that's the ICU too. So if you can get an advantage there, you're willing to spend some more money there, like ventricular assist devices. You know, you don't see them on the floor, you see them first in the ICU. So I think it should be on the floor. I've been advocating for the floor. I think they need more help on the floor. But for whatever reason, for those reasons, there would be a greater impetus to start in the ICU.
Jeff?
The alternative devices, which are a catheter in a peripheral vein or a catheter in a central vein, are somewhat limited because finding a good vein and not having contamination from adjacent infusions, avoiding thrombosis of the vein, all of those issues are ongoing issues that have to be worked out and may not be worked out in a real-world setting. So this type of technology is appealing because it does not require a specialized, localized location. And I can't stress to you the challenges of coming in and finding a good vein in a patient that's been in the hospital for more than a few days. That's a huge challenge. The other issue to think about when we talked about where's this going, I also believe this is going throughout the entire hospital. And what happened with pulse oximeters is the different associations, the Critical Care Society, anesthesia, they all recognize the advantages of real-time monitoring. What's the definition of a real-time monitor? It's something that can detect something early in a timely fashion so you can intervene before there's an adverse event. So with diabetes, there's two adverse events. Hypoglycemia is acute, and hyperglycemia seems to increase morbidity, mortality. And in our hospital, for example, we do close to 4,000 hips or knees each year, artificial joints, and there's a certain incidence of infection, and hyperglycemia has been associated with infection. So that's where I see this going out of the ICU onto the general floors and having a much larger patient population and much more larger market. We do intensive insulin therapy in the step-down unit as well as on our general floors of our hospital. But the key thing that I like about this technology is the wireless. It's small and it's wireless. And some of the competing technologies that are blood-based or even subcutaneous are hardwired, and you're tethered, so people tend to get out of bed and walk, and that is problematic with some of the competing technologies. So it allows for ambulation as well.
You know, the interesting thing is, from my standpoint, and I've been doing this for 20 years now in Portland, been doing it with a point-of-care meter and strips. And from my standpoint, anything that's as good as point-of-care glucose currently is good enough for me, because I get a point-of-care reading every 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, sometimes 4 hours, depending on what the protocol says. And we avoid hypoglycemia 99.1% of the time. With a target of 70 to 110. So for me, if we have more measurements than that, then I'm going to avoid it even more. So for me, even the current accuracy is good enough with our protocol. Now it's going to differ with different protocols and in different centers, but what I say really doesn't matter, because the FDA is going to determine what that's going to be. So if you ask the question, you know, what's good enough, go to Maryland on June 25th and get an idea of what they're going to determine, because we still don't know.
The regulatory authorities have recognized that point accuracy is not the answer, that it's the trend, and watching it go down at a fast rate of decline is more important clinically than the absolute value. We have to figure out how to collect the data to show trend accuracy to get FDA approval. And then once it's available clinically, the clinicians will figure out how to use it and develop nursing protocols. So the FDA is really on our side. They recognize that the point measurements are not the way to go. They'd love to see CGM approved, and we have to help them do that.
Here's how I think it does change the playing field, though. For people like Eileen, who are taking care of patients, and especially for people like Eileen was 27 years ago when she's starting.
27?
10
Nice
years
job,
ago.
Tony.
Yeah,
Way to
you're
go,
dead,
buddy.
Tony. I can tell you that right now.
Very
You're dead.
smooth.
When she was 15, starting in the ICU, it makes glycemic control a lot more tolerable. And when nurses come in and they start trying to do tight glycemic control, they're worried about killing the patient with hypoglycemia, and they're nervous about it. They fear hypoglycemia. And so what this does is it takes some of that fear away, number one. Number two, it could be used to figure out, you know, not to change the protocol, but if the glucose is slamming down quickly, then the nurse is going to go, no matter what the protocol says, I'm checking the glucose again. So those are the two areas that I see. It alters care, but it certainly doesn't change the protocol in an adjunctive use situation.
I like the pulse oximetry analogy. Pulse oximetry was a modality that was supposed to be adjunctive to the frequent measurement of arterial blood gases. And when we were weaning patients in the 80s and early 90s from mechanical ventilation, at one point we were getting hourly blood gases to assist us with each maneuver down the ventilator. Over time, we began getting fewer and fewer arterial blood gases as we developed more and more comfort with pulse oximetry. Today, I almost never get a blood gas as I'm weaning patients. I look at the patient, I look at the pulse oximeter, I do a physical exam. We hardly ever get blood gases. We don't even get blood gases before we extubate the patient from the ventilator. We might not get a blood gas afterwards. You know, and that came with increasing comfort. It took a lot of years, but increasing comfort with what we were given, including the pulse oximeter. So I think it's quite possible that continuous monitoring of blood glucose may start off as adjunctive, but with time and with the comfort level that's obtained by clinicians, you know, we may take steps on our own to reduce the number of laborious intermittent blood glucose measurements, just as we learn. It's part of the learning curve.
The key concept is infection. If we can get more data to show a decreased infection risk with better glucose control, then it'll be a home run.
It's more than infection. It's more than infection. Infection is actually easily controlled. And not only the basic biochemistry literature and the basic physiology literature, but the clinical data support the fact that as long as you're well under 180 milligrams per deciliter, 10 millimolar, you're not going to have an increased risk of infection. So that's like that's a hurdle that's about a foot off the ground for this technology. The bigger hurdle is the mortality hurdle. Bigger hurdle in heart surgery is the atrial fibrillation hurdle, is the length of stay hurdle, because the nadir of that, the low point of all those things is somewhere, I can tell you in heart surgery, it's somewhere between 110 and 125, okay? And so achieving that nadir is the tough thing without having hypoglycemia. So now that gets me into your second question. And you touched on a really, really important point. Just like duration of glycemic control is important in improving outcomes, and staying away from hyperglycemia for a certain period of time, and it has to have duration, just like antibiotics have a duration of therapy. Hypoglycemia too is a time-dependent thing. It's a really important topic that you've touched on. And in the studies where hypoglycemia is associated with poor outcomes, and those outcomes aren't always in the hospital, they can be after you leave the hospital as well. The time between glucose measurements from the normal glycemia to hypoglycemia and back to normal glycemia again is much longer than in studies where you have hypoglycemia for a short duration, as an example. And that's really protocol dependent. As an example, in the Portland protocol, current iteration 70 to 110, last 5,000 patients. There was 0.9% of patients who had hypoglycemia, less than 40. The average time from the time of the previous measurement to less than 40 to greater than 40 again was 33 minutes. 33, and that's protocol dependent. It's protocol dependent because in the protocol, the lower they get, the more frequently you measure. If they go below 40, you're doing things really quickly to get it back up. And in that study, in those 5,000 patients, in the it was 51 patients or 48 patients who had hypoglycemia, there wasn't a single bad event. However, if you look at studies like VICEP that had 17% incidence less than 40, and Glutrol that had 24% incidence less than 40, they were hypoglycemic for a prolonged period of time because they were only measuring every hour or two. And that has a profound effect on outcomes. So I think your point is extremely astute. It's something that most people miss, is that hypoglycemia can be benign if it's treated immediately. It's typically protocol dependent when we have intermittent measurements, but with continuous measurements, it takes the protocol out of it. Maybe that goes to your question, how it modifies a protocol, Pat. It's a great question.
Jeff or Stan, or do you have any follow-up comments?
That was too well articulated.
You want to come to Portland?
These guys have major fist fights sometimes. This is a love fest up here right now.
But to get the real world is, they talk about hourly glucoses, but in reality, maybe not in Portland, but in most places, you get 10 measurements a day, 12 measurements a day. That's the real world. And then you've got a gap.
In most intensive care units, one nurse is being asked to care for 1.5 to 2 patients. That means someone else is just sitting around not getting as much care as they might deserve because they're so focused on that 2 hours a day that a nurse is just checking blood sugars independent of catastrophes.
So I actually have a follow-up question to that. Steve, I'm sorry to co-opt it, but so we talk about acute hypoglycemia 2030. With a continuous monitor, we've always posited, we need to do a clamping study. We've talked about that as it relates to point accuracy. How accurate are we at the low range? But I've always argued we are coming to the position that it's really not how accurate you are at the low range. Is if you're using a continuous device the right way, it's how accurate are you with sort of the margins. How are you between 60 to 90 and 150 to 180? So if you're using a continuous monitor the right way, you should never get to a glucose of 20 to 30 or 40. I mean, assuming somebody's not asleep at the switch. Thoughts on that? I see heads nodding, so it sounds like those are the thoughts, correct?
I think that it's really important to be accurate in the dangerous ranges.
Define the dangerous ranges.
In the low range, I mean, it's important to be accurate in the euglycemia range and slightly hypo range. I mean, super accurate in the 60 to 100 range. I'm not so much as concerned about accuracy in the 2 to 300 range because I'm going to be doing the same thing no matter if it's 220 versus if it's 280. I'm going to do the exact same thing with the insulin protocol, or the protocol is going to do the same thing. So I think it's more important to be accurate in the euglycemic range. It's probably most important.
And at the margins of the euglycemic range too.
And the margins, yeah. It's true. There are 2 patient populations in which there are higher rates of hypoglycemia, 2 populations in general. One is the renal failure dialysis, whether it's peritoneal or hemodialysis population. There are large fluctuations in glucose levels. And protocols can be built around those, and ours is, as an example. And the other population that it's also built around is the enterally fed, not parentally fed, but enterally fed, force-fed patients There are can also be large fluctuations in glucose levels. And the fluctuations are both high and low in both those patient populations.
Jeff?
In addition, there's hypoglycemia induced by insulin, but there's hypoglycemia that is due to patient disease. So patients that are malnourished with sepsis, with end-stage cancer, they're at risk for hypoglycemia as well, and that may be an indication for CGM above and beyond titrating insulin.
And when you ask, well, what will be the impact of continuous glucose monitoring in the hospital setting on the quantity of insulin that a patient receives, the answer is, well, I don't know, because no one studied it. Right now, we've got 2 or 3 or 4 studies in critically ill patients with different devices, and they're just trying to determine, well, I mean, you know, are the measurements we're getting pretty close to the reference blood glucoses or not? No one has even begun to study, well, what was the amount of insulin and what was the eventual outcome on patients? So that's off in the future, and it's presumed at this point. And I think that's a tug of war, actually, between clinicians and scientists and companies. Companies are killing themselves trying to get investments so they can stay alive, develop a product, and bring it to the FDA or get a CE mark in Europe. Clinicians are going, hey, wait, I mean, do we have to stop here with just showing that it works? I mean, can't we do more here? There's so much more we need to do. And so there's this natural and appropriate tension that takes place between the two groups. You guys have to fund them so we can do those studies, and then we can answer your questions.
Yeah, I back that. You know, one of the hardest things for me in this whole issue is, you know, I've been working with and hoping for some continuous glucose measuring company to at least get approval and get into the game in hospital since 2003, 2004. And to watch the funding agencies kind of step back and they see a negative study and they don't really understand the negative study. They don't understand why Nice Sugar said what Nice Sugar said, but I do. They don't understand why the meta-analysis showed what the meta-analysis showed, but I do. And we, Stan and I and Jeff, and we know the pitfalls of these studies, and we know that glycemic control is good. And as we watch the funding sources start to push away and say that's too dangerous for us, I feel really sad for our patients. I mean, I really do. This is something that's going to save lives. It's going to be an incredible advance in medicine. And it's sad when companies can't get funded anymore. I don't care who wins the game. Someone needs to win the game for my patients, because it's going to make everybody's care better.
Jeff, you could speak to that. I mean, you sort of went through that with Animas. I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier.
Yeah, basically, this is the first technology I've ever been involved in where the end user wants something and it's not available. I've been involved with other technologies where we're pushing it on the end user, but this is where the clinician, the people in the trenches say we need something. And that's why we need help from you and Echo and the rest to make this happen.
So Simon Finfer said himself that the conclusion from his Nice Sugar study should have been, we need continuous glucose monitoring. That's Simon's conclusion of Nice Sugar.
So actually, it's really important, whatever technology you happen to be using, that you can database the information. And the reason for that is, as in the real world, you have to change behavior. You change behavior of the residents, behavior of the nursing staff, behavior of the administrators, actually. The only way in an evidence-based world you can change behavior, like in an academic hospital in Boston where I am, is if you show people data. Well, you have to have the data, you have to store it, and then you have to be able to display it in order to persuade people that you're right and they need to invest in what you're advocating. So the ability to store information, learn from it, and then feed it back to the clinicians, to the users, and the people who actually do the work is actually really pivotal to motivate them. My nursing staff believes in the value of glycemic control because we've been doing it since 1998, not as long as Tony, who's a true pioneer, but for a long time and far ahead of most ICUs by far. The only reason they do all this work grudgingly, reluctantly, and unhappily is because they've gotten the feedback from the databasing that we've done. And they get color graphs and they can see the difference. Nurses like to talk about like how they're into patient safety, somewhat irritatingly as though they're the only ones interested in patient safety, like somehow they own that. But nevertheless, you know, they sort of stake that out. Patient safety, we're all about patient safety. So when you show them you need to do all this work, and when you do, it's safer for the patient, they really can't argue very much. The only way you can show that to them is if you have data.
I think that's kind of a twofold question, because are you talking about tight glycemic control, or are you talking about continuous glucose measurement? Because they're two sides of the same coin, and it's one of the things that I want to make sure that the FDA separates out the thought of how are we going to approve a CGM device. And it shouldn't have anything to do with clinical outcomes. It should have to do with its ability to measure glucose, because the clinical outcomes are dependent on where the glucose is driven, and that's dependent on the protocol, and how much hypoglycemia there is, and that's dependent on the protocol. And so they're two separate questions. If tight glycemic control should be done by all hospitals who want to have the best outcomes. Continuous glucose measuring devices probably should be used, but they're not approved yet. And I think those are the two components of your question. And when they're approved, they're probably going to be used in a graduated fashion.
I mean, it's a great example of how, in the setting of conflicting data, basically the world has voted with its feet. Everybody is doing intensive insulin. The only argument is over what range did you want to shoot for. Super tight, like Vandenberg has advocated out of Louvain, all the time without fail, or can we wimp out at blood glucoses of 140, 150? I think as the technology advances and becomes easier to do, the studies to demonstrate how much of a difference it makes will also become easier to do.
Stan, or excuse me, Tony or Jeff, any closing comments?
Just that the initial studies really will be to show point and rate direction accuracy. The devices will then get FDA approval, put in the hands of the clinicians, and then there will be additional studies done funded by NIH and funded by others that will show how to use this device in the real-world setting to improve outcome. And we're all convinced that it will improve outcome and it'll sell itself.